Edaora loved Sunday mornings. She loved waking up to the sound of birds chirping, the scent of her mother's freshly fried akara, and the excitement of wearing her neatly pressed church dress. The church was her second home, a place filled with singing, dancing, and smiles. Most of all, she admired Pastor Joshua. Everyone did. "Pastor Joshua is a man of God," Mama Ada often said. "We are blessed to have him in our lives." At just 10 years old, Edaora had grown up listening to her mother's praises of the pastor. His sermons were captivating, and his kind words made everyone feel special. But Edaora had never imagined that the man she admired so much would one day break her trust in the worst way. It started on an ordinary Sunday. The church service was filled with joyful hymns, Pastor Joshua's passionate preaching, and the usual bustle of the congregation. After the service, Pastor Joshua called out to Edaora. "Ada, my dear," he said warmly, "can you help me with some tasks in my office? I need someone trustworthy." Edaora's heart swelled with pride. "Yes, Pastor," she replied eagerly. Her mother, standing nearby, gave an approving nod. "See? Even Pastor Joshua sees how special you are," Mama Ada whispered. Edaora followed Pastor Joshua to his office, a small room at the back of the church. She had been there before to fetch books or tidy up. But today something felt different. The pastor closed the door behind them. Edaora felt a twinge of unease, but she brushed it aside. This was Pastor Joshua, the man her mother trusted completely. "Sit down, Ada," he said, motioning to a chair. She obeyed, her small hands folded neatly on her lap. At first, he spoke kindly, asking about her school and how she was doing at home. But then his tone changed. He leaned closer, his eyes searching hers in a way that made her stomach tighten. "You know, Ada," he began, "you're very special. God has great plans for you. But you have to trust me. Can you do that?" "Yes, Pastor," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. What followed left Edaora confused and frightened. Pastor Joshua's words became strange, his actions uncomfortable. He tried to make her promise not to tell anyone, saying, "This is our little secret." Edaora's heart raced. She knew something was wrong. She managed to excuse herself, muttering about needing to find her mother. Once outside, she ran as fast as her legs could carry her. Back home, Edaora sat in her room, hugging her knees to her chest. The memory of what happened wouldn't leave her. She had to tell someone. That evening, as Mama Ada prepared dinner, Edaora gathered her courage. "Mama, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling. Mama Ada turned, concern etched on her face. "What is it, Ada? Are you okay?" Edaora hesitated, then poured out everything, how Pastor Joshua had made her uncomfortable, how he tried to make her keep it a secret. To her shock, Mama Ada's expression hardened. "Edaora, do you know what you're saying?" she asked, her voice sharp. "But Mama, it's true," Edaora cried, tears streaming down her face. Mama Ada shook her head. "Pastor Joshua is a man of God. He would never do such a thing. You must have misunderstood." "Mama, I didn't," Edaora insisted, but her mother wouldn't listen. "You will not repeat this nonsense," Mama Ada said firmly. "Do you hear me? You will not bring shame to this family or the church." Edaora felt a wave of despair. The one person she thought would protect her didn't believe her. Over the next few days, Edaora withdrew from everyone. At school, her best friend, Beezy, noticed something was wrong. "Ada, you've been so quiet lately. What's going on?" Beezy asked during lunch. Edaora hesitated but decided to confide in her friend. When she finished, Beezy's eyes were wide with shock. "Ada, this is serious. You can't keep quiet about it." "But my mama doesn't believe me," Edaora whispered. "She thinks I'm lying." "Then we'll find someone else who will believe you," Beezy said firmly. That evening, Beezy brought Edaora to her older cousin, Nkem. Nkem was in her 20s, outspoken and fearless. When Edaora told her story, Nkem didn't hesitate. "Ada, I believe you," she said, "and we're not going to let him get away with this." For the first time since the incident, Edaora felt happy. Nkem was not one to take injustice lightly. After hearing Adaora's story, she knew this was not something they could ignore. "We'll handle this carefully," she said, her tone resolute. "But first, Ada, you must be brave." Adaora looked down at her hands. "What if no one believes me? Even my mama doesn't." Nkem knelt in front of her, taking her hands. "You're stronger than you think. And you're not alone. Beezy and I are here for you." Adaora nodded, a small spark of courage lighting up inside her. The next Sunday, Adaora sat silently beside her mother in church. Pastor Joshua's voice filled the room as he delivered his sermon, but his words felt empty to her now. She couldn't look at him without feeling a wave of anger and fear. After the service, Nkem approached Pastor Joshua with a polite smile. "Pastor, I'd like to have a word with you about something important," she said. "Of course," he replied, his charismatic voice. They stepped into his office, and Nkem's tone shifted. "Pastor Joshua, Adaora has told us everything. We know what you did." His smile faltered for a moment before he quickly recovered. "I'm not sure what you're talking about," he said, his voice calm. "You know exactly what I mean," Nkem shot back. "You've taken advantage of your position, and it's time you faced the consequences." Pastor Joshua leaned back in his chair, a cold smile creeping onto his face. "Be careful with your accusations, young lady. You wouldn't want to damage my reputation or your own." Nkem felt a surge of anger but kept her composure. "We're not afraid of you, Pastor. The truth will come out." As she left the office, her determination only grew. She knew this fight would not be easy, but she was ready. Word began to spread through the community. Some people whispered in support of Adaora, while others defended Pastor Joshua. "How can you accuse a man of God?" one woman said, shaking her head. "Adaora is just a child. Maybe she misunderstood," another added. The mix of reactions was overwhelming for Adaora. She felt the weight of every stare, every judgmental look from the congregation. One afternoon, as she walked home from school with Beezy, a group of church members stopped them. "Is it true, Adaora?" one woman asked. "Did you really say those things about Pastor Joshua?" Adaora froze, her heart pounding. I didn't lie," she stammered. The woman sighed and shook her head. "You're a child. You don't understand what you're saying." Beezy stepped forward, her voice firm. "Ada isn't lying. You should be ashamed of yourselves for doubting her." The group murmured but didn't press further. Nkem decided it was time to involve someone who could help. She reached out to a lawyer she knew through a women's rights organization. The lawyer, Mrs. Evelyn, agreed to meet with Adaora. During their meeting, Mrs. Evelyn listened patiently as Adaora recounted her experience. "You're very brave, Adaora," she said. "I believe you, and I'll do everything I can to help." For the first time, Adaora felt like justice was within reach. Meanwhile, Mama Ada was grappling with her own internal conflict. She wanted to trust her daughter, but her faith in Pastor Joshua was deeply rooted. One evening, Nkem confronted her. "Auntie, how can you ignore Adaora's pain? You're her mother. She needs you." Mama Ada sighed, her hands trembling. "I don't know what to believe, Nkem. Pastor Joshua has been a blessing to this family. How can he do such a thing? But what if he did?" Nkem pressed. "What if Adaora is telling the truth, and you're letting her suffer alone?" Mama Ada had no answer. A week later, during a church service, Adaora stood up. Her legs shook, but she held her head high. "Excuse me, Pastor," she said, her voice trembling but loud enough to carry through the room. The congregation fell silent. "I need to speak," she continued. "Something happened to me, and I can't stay silent anymore." Gasps filled the room as Adaora recounted her story. She didn't hold back, describing every detail with clarity and courage. Pastor Joshua tried to interrupt, but Nkem and Mrs. Evelyn stood up. "Let her speak," Nkem said firmly. When Adaora finished, the room was divided. Some people clapped in support, while others murmured in disbelief. The case against Pastor Joshua gained traction. Mrs. Evelyn gathered witnesses and evidence, presenting a strong case to the authorities. Slowly, more victims came forward, emboldened by Adaora's courage. The community's perception of Pastor Joshua began to shift. His once unshakable reputation crumbled as the truth came to light. Mama Ada, finally convinced of her daughter's honesty, broke down in tears. "Ada, I'm so sorry," she said, hugging her tightly. "I should have believed you from the start." "It's okay, Mama," Adaora said, though her voice was heavy with emotion. "I just needed you to listen." With Pastor Joshua removed from the church and facing legal consequences, the community began to heal. Adaora found strength in sharing her story, inspiring others to speak out against abuse and injustice. She learned that bravery wasn't about never being afraid. It was about standing up even when fear tried to hold her back. And as she walked through the streets of her neighborhood, she held her head high, knowing she had reclaimed her voice and her power.